I have been watching a ton of blind playthroughs of Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, and I've been noticing some trends that they need to change for Part 2. Here are my 7 things that Square Enix needs to change in Part 2 of the remake of Final Fantasy VII.
Huh? Wait a minute, did you just...
Nope.
Now, to elaborate on the blind playthroughs, these blind playthroughs are generally of people who have never played Final Fantasy VII or the Final Fantasy franchise at all, so they're coming into this brand new to the series. They don't know the storyline, and most of these changes are more cosmetic or to do with the way the game is played, not so much the storyline. We'll be going over story elements in another video, but let's get started. So the first thing they need to work on is blue materia.
No, hell no!
Now, I don't think there was anything wrong with blue materia in Part 1. The one thing that I noticed, though, in like 9 out of 10 playthroughs that I watched, is that there just needed to be a quick, like sidebar tutorial on how to use blue materia. And I'm not gonna lie, in the original, they really didn't hold your hand. I mean, if I didn't have the original strategy guide, I probably would have just done a horrible job setting my blue materia in linked slots. And it's the linked slots that people really don't get. They don't realize that there's a difference between linked and unlinked until either further on in the game, they just don't read the descriptions that say what materia the blues can be linked up with. And it usually took someone in their chat or in their comment section teaching them how to use the blue materia properly. But there have been also cases where I saw entire playthroughs, like to the very end, the battle with Sephiroth, where they still hadn't learned to fully use their blue materia, and they had already recorded, all of their playthroughs, so I couldn't intervene and help them out. Not in all of them. But let's go on to our next thing that needs to change for Part 2, and that is the Area Search Quest mini-map.
I'm sick of this.
So, if you remember in Part 1, whenever we got an Area Search Quest, it could be kind of difficult to see. I mean, if you look here on the computer, you're going to see that, when you're zoomed in, you don't realize that the little goal icon is actually just the center of this really faint green circle that encompasses the search area. And when you're running around with just the little mini-map up in the upper right corner of the screen, all it does is just have goal and the border flashes green. That really doesn't tell you that you're in an area search. It just kind of, it didn't do a good job of showing that, hey, look, this area is where you need to look, not just in the middle of this goal. I can't tell you how many first-time players I saw running around the goal trying to figure out where they were supposed to go. And finally they would give up and just end up stumbling upon one of the areas, maybe, where they needed to go, or they would just give up altogether. Perhaps if they had some kind of wave emanating from the center and going out from the goal, maybe that would give a better indication. But yeah, you can tell that when zoomed in, it's honestly not obvious. That's a quick one. Once again, a cosmetic thing. Let's move on to the third thing they need to change, and that is aerial combat.
Do I have a problem with that? Oh, you can bet.
Now, I know you guys have heard this a lot, but a lot of people feel like Intergrade did a better job with aerial combat. I would disagree. Yuffie in general is a ranged fighter. She has ranged moves natively, so she's almost kind of like a pseudo Barret in that, well, she's a ranged fighter, so aerial combat just comes naturally to her. And you guys can argue that they did improve upon it, but what about when we get Tifa and Cloud and Red 13 back in the party? How's aerial combat going to work for them? Are they going to maybe give us some ranged moves that we can use that maybe just cost an ATB or a little bit of MP or something. I know that part of the beauty of the system is that, hey, these guys specialized in ranged combat, but does that mean that they also should have to be the specialists in aerial combat too? I don't know. You guys tell me, what do you think your fix for ranged combat or aerial combat would be? That's a pretty short, obvious one, and a gripe with tons of people. So let's move on to our next thing, which is the triangle hold to interact with objects and just the slow walks in general.
Okay, now I'm mad.
Well, basically, the things that slow down the pace of a game unnaturally. Now, I want to say first that my only gripe is just the hold to interact. Whenever you have to, say, just pull a lever to open a door and Cloud is just standing there like, okay, now I'll pull it. I feel like God of War is a good example of what to do. Either give us some kind of interaction where we have to maybe tap the button in order to achieve something, like maybe the lever is just really hard to pull, or in God of War, you just hit the button once and he goes through the animation of doing whatever it is he needs to do. Maybe it's breaking through a wall, maybe it is tearing something down, maybe it is opening a door. We never have to hold there, and I know that in some cases God of War also hides loading screens by having long corridors, but Final Fantasy VII is loaded with these areas. Some of these areas I understand, yeah, they are hiding loading screens, and some of these slow walk areas where we actually get story, I'm okay with. I mean, if you think about it, check out this scene with Tifa. What are your options, really? I mean, they kind of give you a middle ground by giving you control of the character while you're listening to this expositionary dialogue, or this, plot building or character building dialogue. What are your other options? Either to completely lose control of the character, or to have free reign of the character running around like a doofus and getting to your goal before the dialogue ends, and either cutting the dialogue off or just having to stand there, at the staircase with some kind of invisible wall in front of you, like, well, gotta wait for this dialogue to end before we can go up the stairs. So I'm okay with that kind of slow walking. But there are other segments where it feels unnatural, like, why is the game making me slow walk here? And then there are the shimmying areas, like especially in Wall Market, where you need to get into the back alleys just to get one little treasure box. I mean, look at this. You have to squeeze through this area. It's not hiding a loading screen at all. They just made you slow down your pace so much. And it's not like it's a secret, because if you have the minimap, you can tell there's an alley there to get into. So just get rid of those altogether. Just let us run back into areas like that. And I think in the PS5 era, we are going to see a lot less of these, though we may still run into them from time to time. But nevertheless, they shouldn't add in those artificial ones either, though, like squeezing into the alleyways or the strange slow walk areas where you can tell that it was meant to slow you down for some dialogue, but the dialogue's over and you're still walking slow and you're like, okay, when can I speed back up? So yeah, getting rid of the hold to interact and the unnecessary slow walk areas is that. Now my next one is also a big contention with a lot of people, and that is less linearity.
Oh, you gotta be kidding me!
A lot of people are wanting open world, and they said, oh, the original Final Fantasy VII was open world. Well, there's a little bit of nostalgia, I think, at play here when you think of the open world aspect of Final Fantasy VII. You really don't get this open world feel until you've gotten your vehicles that allow you to overcome a lot of obstacles. And you don't feel it until you get the tiny Bronco. But in the original, once you got the tiny Bronco, I mean, this was what open world looked like. Yeah, it's just just continuing to try and find something to do. I mean, you can go land on different islands and fight different monsters, sure. You can find the Bone Village, and yes, there is this openness to the world that was once actually very linear. What I think a lot of people's gripes were the sort of alleyway construction of all the different chapters. But that's kind of how the original Midgar was too. The original Midgar was alleyways and tunnels and hallways. That was what Midgar was made up of. But once we get out into this more open environment, yes, we do need to have wide linearity. So if you think about it, once we left Midgar, yeah, there was this open world, but there really wasn't anything to do except figure out where the different locations were, such as Calm and the Chocobo Ranch and the Mithril Mine. And then you get through the Mithril Mine and you've got this wide linearity where, hey, I can follow the story, or I can go off to this one other location, which is Fort Condor. So you can pretty much draw a single line around the map to show the progression of your story. And even after you get vehicles, you're still taken away from them from time to time to follow another linear path, even though it may be on the world map. So wide linear with open areas where, yeah, there might be some side quests here, and then you narrow down and get some story, and then you open back up and get more wide linearity with maybe some side quest areas. I think a lot of people who want this maybe played Final Fantasy 15. Maybe that was their first Final Fantasy experience. But then also I think a lot of the OG fans just kind of remember having the high wind and like, hey, that's open world. Yeah, that's open world once you get the airship. But we also have to make sure that we don't have too much of this open world, because if, once again, using Final Fantasy 15, I haven't played through it all the way, but I can already tell that they gave a lot of attention to side quests, and the story so far is kind of just bare bones. And from what I've heard of other critiques, a lot of people felt that the main storyline was lacking. So that's definitely not what Final Fantasy VII is about. Final Fantasy VII is story heavy. So the best I think that you can hope for are wide linearity sections followed by narrow paths followed by more wide linearity. That's all I'm going to say on that. Let me know what you think about the wide linearity concept, or whether you liked or disliked the design of the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1. I would say that Wall Market is a good example of how they did open it up. Even though you're going down streets and alleyways, that was a nice open area to explore. So do you want more stuff like that, or more of the wide forest areas? Let me know. Moving on, our next area is Invisible Walls.
You have got to be shitting me.
This kind of goes off with the whole, kind of corridor map building. There are some areas in these maps that we were traveling in, notably in Sector 7. I remember there being a lot, like where if you played Intermission, Jesse was sitting at that table outside of Seventh Heaven. There's enough room to get by that table, but there's just this invisible wall. Like, no, you've got actually, if you go from behind the Seventh Heaven up to that table, you're stuck. You've got to go back behind Seventh Heaven and then around if you want to go in the front. Just let us squeeze by those areas. Once again, Final Fantasy VII, or Final Fantasy 15, I mean, is a good example of how they didn't have too many invisible walls. But I will say this, Final Fantasy 15 did do the slow walk areas really, really bad. And I don't even know if they were hiding loading screens or not. That's, I think, something really simple. Just get rid of the invisible barriers. Just give us logical barriers that would impede our movement. And then the last thing that we need changed in Final Fantasy Remake Part 2 is just the camera, the combat camera, in tight locations.
This is ridiculous.
We see this all the way in Chapter 1 of Remake Part 1, where in certain areas, objects will obstruct the camera's view, and especially when you're needing to attack high characters, like either up high or flying characters, you just notice that the camera just doesn't feel right. Even if you adjust some settings, the camera doesn't feel right. Objects get in front of it, and the way they can fix this is perhaps just add some kind of transparency where, hey, if the camera needs to go through an object to get to the main characters and the main actions, maybe it just kind of makes everything transparent that's in front of it. I've seen this kind of thing before in other games, and I'm sure they can implement this in Remake Part 2. So those are my 7 changes to make for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. Let me know in a comment below if I missed anything, or if you felt that some of the changes I talked about were like, yeah, that's definitely something that needs to change. And I hope that you saw some changes in here that you haven't seen in other change videos for the remake. Be sure to check out these other videos that are also about theory crafting and Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 and Part 1. And look forward to more on the Felroad Express. Thanks for watching. Check you next time.